For years, the question hovered over every discussion, every clip, every late-night thread about the Whittaker family. It was asked bluntly, whispered cautiously, and sometimes shouted without restraint. Who was Timmy Whittaker's father? The mystery became a kind of fuel, driving speculation that spread faster than facts and lingered longer than truth. What made the question so powerful was not curiosity alone. It was the way the unknown allowed people to project their own conclusions. Some pointed inward, accusing members of the family who were already struggling under the weight of poverty, disability, and public scrutiny. Others looked outward, guessing at shadows, inventing villains with no names. Over time, those guesses hardened. Repetition gave them the appearance of certainty. But mystery does not equal absence of truth. Sometimes the truth exists quietly, carried by the people closest to it, long before the world is ready to hear it. The confirmation of Timmy's father did not arrive as a dramatic reveal engineered for attention. It did not come through leaked documents or legal proceedings. It came through something far less sensational and far more sobering. Family testimony spoken plainly, without theatrics, after decades of silence. That confirmation has changed how this story must be told. Because once the father is identified, the focus can no longer remain on rumor. It shifts toward accountability, toward context, and toward the reality of what Timmy's existence represents. This is not just a solved puzzle. It is the exposure of a wound that was always there, hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding and neglect. Timmy was born into a family that lived far from the reach of most institutions people take for granted. The Whittakers existed in a space where isolation was normal, where generations lived and died without regular medical care, formal education, or meaningful oversight. That environment shaped everything, including how trauma was absorbed and how secrets were kept. When people first encountered the Whittaker family online, the reaction was immediate and extreme. Viewers focused on appearances, on behavior, on genetics. Labels came quickly. Empathy came unevenly. And in the absence of verified information, speculation filled the gap. The identity of Timmy's father became the centerpiece of that speculation. Some theories were built on proximity, others on resemblance, others on nothing more than intuition. Each theory ignored a fundamental reality. This was a family living under conditions where vulnerability was constant and protection was minimal. Harm in such environments does not always leave records. It leaves consequences. The confirmation of Timmy's father forces a reckoning with that reality. It establishes that the mystery was never evidence of something unspeakable happening within the family itself. Instead, it points to something equally disturbing but often overlooked: the exploitation of a vulnerable woman in a place where reporting was unlikely and accountability was rare. This matters because for years, the absence of a named father allowed blame to drift toward those who were visible. Family members who appeared on camera became targets simply because they were present. They were scrutinized, accused, and judged by strangers who had no access to the full story. Now, with confirmation, that narrative collapses. Timmy's father was not a secret hidden in plain sight within the household. He was a man outside the immediate family, someone whose actions left a permanent mark and then faded into obscurity long before the Whittakers became known to the world. This reframes everything. It reframes how Timmy's disabilities are discussed. It reframes how the family's dynamics are interpreted. And it reframes the moral responsibility of those who consume the story without questioning the cost of speculation. The confirmation also brings Lorraine Whittaker into sharper focus. For much of the public conversation, she existed as a background figure, rarely centered despite being central to the story. Her limited speech and cognitive impairments made her easy to overlook and easy to misunderstand. But her experience is not secondary. It is foundational. Timmy's birth was not simply the result of isolation or genetics. It was the result of violence inflicted on someone who lacked the power, resources, and voice to seek justice. That truth transforms the story from one of curiosity to one of consequence. It also exposes how easily vulnerable people can be erased when they do not fit the narratives people expect. Lorraine did not tell her story in the way audiences are accustomed to hearing trauma described. There were no prepared statements, no structured explanations. There was only the reality of a life lived under constraints most viewers cannot imagine. And yet, that reality existed long before cameras arrived. By the time the Whittaker family became known online, the most critical events in their history had already passed. The harm had already been done. The systems that might have intervened earlier had not reached them. What the internet encountered was not the beginning of a tragedy, but the aftermath. The confirmation of Timmy's father underscores that point. It shows that the most important answers were never going to be found in comment sections or frame-by-frame analyses. They were held by the people who lived the story, who carried it quietly while the rest of the world looked elsewhere. This is why the moment matters now. Not because it satisfies curiosity, but because it demands responsibility. It demands that viewers reconsider how they engage with stories involving vulnerable people. It demands reflection on how easily speculation turns into accusation when facts are absent and patience is thin. Timmy is not a mystery to be solved. He is a person whose life began under circumstances he did not choose and could not control. His story deserves accuracy, not amplification of harm. As the news spreads that his father has been confirmed, there will be renewed attention. There will be reactions ranging from relief to anger to disbelief. But the most important response is restraint. Restraint in repeating rumors that have already been disproven. Restraint in assigning blame where it does not belong. Restraint in treating human lives as puzzles for entertainment. Because the confirmation closes one chapter but opens another. It shifts the story away from endless guessing and toward understanding how such a tragedy could unfold unnoticed for so long. This is not the end of the Whittaker story. It is the point where it must be told differently. What follows is not about shock value. It is about tracing the truth carefully, acknowledging the harm done by speculation, and recognizing the deeper failures that allowed this story to remain hidden for decades. The mystery is over. The responsibility is not. Once the question of Timmy Whittaker's father is no longer a guessing game, the story takes a turn that many people weren't prepared for. The energy shifts from speculation to consequence. Because when a name replaces a rumor, it doesn't just answer curiosity. It forces accountability not only for what happened but for how the story has been handled for years. For a long time, the absence of confirmation allowed people to tell themselves they were just asking questions. But questions repeated loudly enough become accusations. And accusations, even unproven ones, leave damage behind. Before the father was confirmed, two things happened simultaneously. First, the internet treated the Whittaker family as a puzzle. Second, the family lived with the weight of those assumptions in real time. Those two realities collided in ways that outsiders rarely acknowledge. Larry became a focal point because he was visible. He spoke. He stood on the porch. He interacted with the camera. That visibility made him an easy target. People took his presence and transformed it into suspicion. They confused responsibility within the household with guilt for something far more serious. Over time, those suspicions hardened into something uglier. But visibility is not evidence. The same happened with Kenny. Facial features were compared. Screenshots were frozen. A resemblance was treated like a confession. Entire theories were built on the idea that he looks like him, as if genetics in an already complex family tree could be reduced to a glance. What those theories ignored was the broader reality of the environment Timmy was born into. The Whittakers lived in extreme isolation. Generations had limited access to healthcare, education, or outside support. Developmental disabilities were not addressed. They were absorbed into daily life. Privacy barely existed. Vulnerability was constant. In environments like that, harm doesn't always look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks unreported. It looks like something people don't talk about because talking doesn't lead anywhere. The confirmation of Timmy's father reframes the entire timeline. It establishes that the harm did not originate from within the immediate household, but from outside it. That matters because it reveals how easily outsiders can cause irreversible damage and disappear without consequence, especially when the victim lacks the power to be heard. Lorraine Whittaker did not have the tools most people rely on to protect themselves. She lived with cognitive limitations. She relied on routine and familiarity. She depended on those around her to help her navigate the world. That combination made her extraordinarily vulnerable. And vulnerability, when paired with isolation, is dangerous. The man identified as Timmy's father was not someone the internet could analyze through video clips. He was not someone whose behavior could be scrutinized after the fact. He lived his life largely unnoticed in the same geographic pocket, long before cameras ever arrived. By the time the world became interested in the Whittakers, he was already gone. That absence created space for misdirected blame. People often ask why no report was made, why no intervention happened, why no one stepped in. Those questions assume a system that was accessible and responsive. But Lorraine's reality existed outside those assumptions. Reporting requires awareness. Intervention requires access. Justice requires someone to listen. None of those were guaranteed where she lived. The confirmation forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The mystery was not unsolved because the truth was hidden. It was unsolved because the people involved were invisible. When Timmy was born, the focus was not on investigating circumstances. It was on survival, on feeding another mouth, on managing daily life with limited resources. Trauma did not pause life, it became part of it. This is where the story becomes harder to consume, because it asks viewers to move beyond outrage and into reflection. It asks whether the fascination with the Whittakers ever translated into understanding their reality. For years, people dissected their lives without acknowledging the structural failures that shaped them. Poverty was treated as a backdrop instead of a driving force. Disability was treated as spectacle instead of vulnerability. Isolation was treated as curiosity instead of danger. The confirmation of Timmy's father exposes those blind spots. It also challenges the idea that the internet is good at uncovering truth. In this case, the loudest voices were not the most accurate. The most repeated theories were not the most informed. And the people most confident in their conclusions were often the farthest from the truth. The truth, when it finally emerged, was quieter. It came from within the family. It came without drama. It came without the urgency of virality. And because of that, it was easy to overlook until it could no longer be ignored. Now that it is out in the open, the question becomes, what do people do with it? One option is to treat it as closure, to say the mystery is solved and move on. But that approach risks repeating the same pattern of neglect that allowed the story to remain hidden in the first place. Another option is to use the confirmation as a moment of accountability, not just for the individual responsible for the harm, but for the systems and attitudes that failed to protect Lorraine and Timmy. Accountability means acknowledging that speculation caused harm, that real people lived under suspicion without evidence, that narratives built for engagement often ignore the human cost. It also means recognizing that confirmation does not erase trauma. It does not undo what happened. It does not restore what was lost. It simply clarifies where the harm came from. Timmy's life has been shaped by forces he never chose. His disabilities, his upbringing, his sudden exposure to the world, none of these were decisions he made. The same is true for Lorraine. Their stories intersect, but they are not interchangeable. Too often, Lorraine has been treated as a footnote. The confirmation of Timmy's father should change that. It centers her experience in a way that can no longer be ignored. It forces people to acknowledge that Timmy's existence began with violence, not mystery. And that acknowledgement carries responsibility. Responsibility to speak carefully. Responsibility to avoid sensationalism. Responsibility to prioritize dignity over curiosity. Because the most damaging thing now would be to replace one harmful narrative with another. To turn confirmation into another form of exploitation. To use trauma as content instead of context. This story is not about winning an argument. It is about understanding how easily vulnerable people can be harmed when no one is watching, and how easily that harm can be misrepresented when everyone suddenly is. As attention grows, so does the risk of distortion. That is why it matters how this chapter is handled. The truth deserves patience. It deserves nuance. It deserves respect. Timmy Whittaker's father has been confirmed. But the real work begins after confirmation. The work of undoing damage, of correcting narratives, and of learning from a story that should never have taken so long to be believed. In the next part, the focus shifts again. away from the identity of the father and toward the impact this truth has had on Timmy himself and on the decisions made by the state. Because confirmation does not exist in a vacuum. It reshapes, lives in the present, not just the past. And that impact is where the story becomes most urgent. Once Timmy Whittaker's father was confirmed, the story stopped being theoretical. It stopped living in comment sections and timelines and started colliding with real-world consequences. Because confirmation doesn't just rewrite the past. It reshapes the present. For Timmy, the confirmation didn't arrive as a revelation. He didn't suddenly gain language for what happened. He didn't sit down and process a narrative arc the way viewers do. Timmy has always lived inside the outcome, not the explanation. His life has been defined by routine, environment, and the people around him, not by labels or genealogy charts. But for the systems watching him, confirmation changed everything. When authorities look at vulnerable adults, context matters. Family dynamics matter. Risk assessments matter. And once the origin of Timmy's birth was understood as an act of violence committed by someone outside the immediate household, it reframed years of assumptions. The household was no longer just a place of concern because of poverty or neglect. It became a place shaped by unresolved trauma that had never been addressed by any institution. That distinction is crucial. For years, the Whittaker home existed in a gray area. Known but not intervened upon. Visible to neighbors but not formally protected. It was a situation that many people noticed and few acted on. When media attention exploded, that gray area vanished overnight. Suddenly, there were eyes everywhere. The same exposure that brought donations and sympathy also brought scrutiny. Officials who may have previously overlooked the situation were now forced to answer questions. Not because conditions had changed overnight, but because visibility had. Once the story reached a global audience, inaction became harder to justify. This is where Timmy's life took a sharp turn. Adult Protective Services doesn't act in a vacuum. Their decisions are shaped by reports, assessments, and perceived risk. When a vulnerable adult is living in an environment deemed unsafe, removal becomes a legal tool, even when it is emotionally devastating. For Timmy, removal meant separation from the only world he had ever known. People often talk about intervention as rescue. But rescue is rarely clean. Especially for someone whose sense of safety is tied to familiarity, not comfort. Timmy knew that house. He knew the porch. He knew the dirt road. He knew the sounds, the smells, the routines. Those things mattered more to him than plumbing upgrades or better lighting. When the state stepped in, it did so with the intention of protection. But protection comes with disruption. Lorraine was removed too. A woman who had lived her entire adult life in one place, surrounded by the same faces, suddenly found herself elsewhere. For someone with cognitive limitations, that kind of upheaval can be deeply destabilizing. Safety does not automatically equal peace. Betty and Larry were left behind. For years, they had been portrayed as caretakers, enablers, villains, victims, depending on who was telling the story. Now they were simply two aging siblings in an empty house, waiting for information they weren't fully given. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it refuses to settle into clean moral categories. Was the removal necessary? Many would argue yes. The conditions were unsafe. The risks were real. Vulnerable adults deserve protection. Was the removal traumatic? Also yes. Trauma does not cancel out necessity. It exists alongside it. What makes this situation particularly painful is timing. The state acted only after exposure. Only after millions of people had already seen the conditions. Only after years of neglect had already taken their toll. That delay matters. If intervention had come earlier, Lorraine might have received support before decades passed. Timmy might have had access to services earlier in life. The family might have been spared the chaos that came with sudden fame. Instead, everything happened at once. Exposure, scrutiny, removal. For Timmy, the confirmation of his father did not bring clarity. It brought consequence. His identity, once treated as a mystery for entertainment, became a factor in legal and protective decisions. His trauma, once ignored, became part of a file. His life, once invisible, became regulated. This raises a question few people want to ask. Does visibility help when it arrives too late? The internet often celebrates itself for bringing attention to forgotten people. But attention without infrastructure can do more harm than good. When systems are overwhelmed or unprepared, visibility accelerates decisions without allowing for thoughtful transition. Timmy did not ask to be known. He did not ask to be analyzed. He did not ask for his parentage to become a public debate. And yet his life became all of those things. The confirmation of his father should have been a moment of truth. Instead, it became another layer in a story that already weighed heavily on him. For Lorraine, the confirmation reopened wounds that had never healed. Her trauma was no longer private. It was validated but also exposed. Validation is important, but exposure can be re-traumatizing, especially when the survivor lacks control over the narrative. Lorraine did not choose to tell her story to the world. Others told it around her. This is a critical distinction. Consent is not just about appearing on camera. It is about agency over one's story. Lorraine's agency was limited long before cameras arrived. Confirmation did not restore it. It simply made her pain legible to outsiders. For Betty, confirmation brought a different burden. As the sister who spoke, who named the man, who carried the family's history out loud, she became a focal point. Some praised her for honesty. Others questioned her motives. Few acknowledged the weight of being the only voice capable of articulating what happened. Betty did not just reveal information. She carried decades of silence into public view. Anne Larry, long accused without evidence, was left to live with the aftermath of rumors that never fully disappear. Even when cleared by truth, suspicion lingers. The internet rarely corrects itself with the same intensity it accuses. This is why confirmation matters beyond curiosity. It forces a reckoning with how narratives are built and who pays the price for them. Timmy's situation now exists within systems that prioritize safety but struggle with nuance. He is protected but separated. He is cared for but displaced. He is safer but not necessarily happier. And that contradiction is hard for people to accept. Many want a clear ending, a rescue arc, a moment where everything becomes better. Real life rarely offers that, especially not for people whose lives have been shaped by neglect long before help arrived. The confirmation of Timmy's father also challenges a deeper assumption, that knowing the truth automatically leads to justice. In this case, justice is complicated. The man responsible is no longer alive. There will be no trial, no sentence, no public accountability. The truth exists, but consequences are limited to those still living. That reality can feel unsatisfying, even unfair. But it reflects a broader pattern in cases involving vulnerable victims. Harm often goes unpunished when victims lack power. What remains is responsibility. Responsibility to care for those affected. Responsibility to stop repeating harmful narratives. Responsibility to ensure that intervention does not become another form of harm. For viewers, this is the moment to slow down. To move away from speculation and toward understanding. To recognize that stories like Timmy's are not puzzles to solve, but lives to respect. If confirmation teaches anything, it is this. The loudest story is not always the truest, and the most visible harm is not always the most damaging. The damage done by years of silence, neglect, and misdirected blame cannot be undone by a single revelation. But it can inform how we respond now. Timmy's future depends not on how many people know his story, but on how carefully that knowledge is handled. On whether systems provide stability instead of disruption. On whether empathy replaces curiosity. As this story continues to unfold, one question remains unanswered. Not who Timmy's father was, but what responsibility the rest of us carry now that we know. If you followed this story, take a moment before reacting. Ask yourself whether your interest helps or harms. Whether sharing adds clarity or noise. Whether commenting contributes understanding or speculation. And if you have informed thoughts, verified information, or a perspective grounded in care rather than curiosity, share it respectfully below. This conversation matters, and how we have it matters even more. By the time the confirmation of Timmy Whittaker's father reached the wider public, the damage from years of speculation had already settled in. Truth does not arrive to a clean slate. It lands on top of assumptions, half-remembered clips, and narratives people have grown emotionally attached to. And that makes the final chapter of this story less about revelation and more about responsibility. Because now that the mystery is no longer a mystery, the question becomes uncomfortable. What do we do with the truth? For years, Timmy's identity was treated like an unsolved case. Viewers analyzed his expressions, his mannerisms, his genetics. They debated who he resembled and what that resemblance meant. All of it happened without Timmy's consent, without Lorraine's voice, and without regard for how accusations echo long after they're disproven. Now that the father has been confirmed, those theories collapse under their own weight. But collapsing theories do not automatically erase harm. The accusations aimed at Larry, Kenny, and others do not simply disappear because a different name has been spoken. Those men lived under suspicion generated by strangers, not evidence. That matters. It matters because this story is not just about who caused harm, but about how easily harm is reassigned when people are poor, disabled, and visible. The confirmation forces a shift away from sensationalism and toward systemic failure. Lorraine's story did not unfold the way it did because of one bad decision or one isolated incident. It unfolded because she lived in a place where protection was absent, where vulnerability was normalized, and where reporting a crime was neither safe nor realistic. This is the part of the story that rarely holds attention. It's easier to focus on individual villains than on collective neglect. It's easier to argue about paternity than to confront how a disabled woman could be assaulted and left without justice for decades. It's easier to blame a family than to ask why no one intervened earlier. But the truth demands that question. Why did Lorraine live her entire life without consistent medical care, legal advocacy, or meaningful oversight? Why was Timmy born into conditions that everyone now agrees were unsafe, yet allowed to persist for so long? Why did help only arrive after millions of people were watching? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that matter far more than internet theories ever did. For Timmy, the future is now defined by systems rather than speculation. He is no longer just a viral figure. He is a protected adult with needs that require structure, care, and stability. That stability will not come from attention. It will come from consistency. For Lorraine, the story remains unfinished in a different way. Her trauma has finally been acknowledged, but acknowledgement is not justice. The man responsible will never answer for what he did. That absence of accountability is something many survivors live with, especially those whose lives unfold far from institutions designed to protect them. Acknowledgement matters, but it does not heal everything. And for Betty and Larry, the confirmation brings both relief and grief. Relief that accusations aimed inward can finally be put to rest. Grief that the truth does not reunite their family, does not undo removal, and does not restore the life they knew. This is the hardest part for people watching from the outside to accept. Truth does not always fix things. Sometimes it only clarifies how broken they already were. The Whittaker story now stands as a case study in what happens when isolation, poverty, disability, and silence intersect. It shows how harm can persist unnoticed for decades. It shows how visibility can arrive too late to prevent trauma but early enough to reshape lives permanently. It also shows how easily narratives spin out of control when audiences forget there are real people behind the footage. Timmy is not a symbol. Lorraine is not a plot device. The Whittakers are not content. They are human beings whose lives were shaped by forces larger than any one decision. The confirmation of Timmy's father should be the end of speculation, not the beginning of a new cycle. It should mark a moment where curiosity gives way to care, where discussion becomes more careful, and where empathy replaces accusation. If there is anything to take forward from this story, it is this. Being informed carries responsibility. Knowing the truth means choosing how to speak about it, choosing whether to repeat harm or prevent it. Stories like this test us. They reveal how quickly we judge, how eagerly we guess, and how rarely we pause to consider the cost. They ask us to slow down, to listen, and to remember that the people at the center of viral stories continue living long after the internet moves on. The mystery is over. The consequences remain. What happens next depends less on what we know and more on how we act with that knowledge. If you followed this story, take a moment and reflect. Do you feel closure or do you feel discomfort? Do you feel informed or do you feel implicated? Those reactions matter. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think about the confirmation of Timmy Whittaker's father? Do you believe the focus should shift away from speculation and toward accountability and care? What responsibility do viewers, creators, and institutions have when stories like this go public? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.